Thank you very much, Richard. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the public lecture this afternoon entitled Chris Thorogood and Diego Zancani in Conversation, sponsored by the Friends of the Bodleian. As Richard said, my name is Samuel Fanous, and my job is to look after the publishing program in the Bodleian Library. The Friends hold 2 public lectures each term, of which this is the first in this term. And for those of you who may not know, may I remind you that the Friends of the Bodleian Library have a series of events throughout the year which carry on despite the present circumstances. They also have magazines, discounts, which are exclusive to members, and you can find out more about these on the Friends website, which is visit.bodleian.ox.ac.uk/friends-of-the-Bodleian. Or if you can't remember that, just Google Friends of the Bodleian Library and it will take you to the page as I did. For our public event this afternoon, I'm delighted that we have 2 distinguished authors who've agreed to join us and to speak with us about their books, Diego Zancani and Chris Thorogood. Diego arrived in Britain, he says, as an alien in 1969 with a 2-year contract at the University of Reading. He continued to teach Italian language and literature and culture and moved on to 2 other universities, Liverpool and Canterbury, until he was appointed in 1995 as a fellow of Balliol College. His main research interests have been in Renaissance and modern culture, the history of language, and the history of food. And from 2004 to 2010, he was in charge of the Graduate Center at Balliol, the beautiful Holywell Manor building, and had the rather splendid title of Praefectus. In 2007, he was honored in state and was made a commendatore, or a commander, of a special order, an honor given by the President of the Italian Republic. He's now an emeritus professor and an emeritus fellow at Balliol College. And his most recent book, How We Fell in Love with Italian Food, was shortlisted for the prestigious Guild of Food Writers Annual Award. Chris Thorogood is the Deputy Director and the Head of Science at the University of Oxford Botanic Garden and Arboretum. He's also a lecturer in biology in the university's Department of Plant Sciences. Chris's research focuses on the evolution of parasitic and carnivorous plants, conservation of parasitic plants, plant diversity in the Mediterranean basin and Japan, and the biometric application of plants. Chris is a real ambassador for public engagement with plants, and chances are, if you've listened to Radio 4's Garden Question Time recently, you'll have heard Chris, where he is a regular panelist. Chris has a range of best-selling titles to his name, including both specialist field guides and popular titles. His most recent book, The Botany of Gin, has been very well received and widely so, including, I would say, one of the most hallowed, it's been reviewed in one of the most hallowed culinary organs, and one that I read regularly, the Waitrose Monthly Food Magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, our speakers this afternoon. Okay, I'd like to ask you each a series of questions, Diego and Chris, the same question, but thinking about your individual titles. And I've grouped the questions into categories. So broadly history, ingredients, popularity, and then last but not least, provenance and place. So if we can begin with history, and Diego, if I could begin with you, we tend to think of our love affair with Italian food as something quite recent, perhaps beginning in the late 19th century, or really maybe after the war in the 20th century, perhaps with an author like Elizabeth who made Italian food so much more, who increased the knowledge of Italian food in Britain, and yet, in fact, our association with Italian food goes back a lot further. Can you tell us something about the early history of our exposure to and our adoption of Italian cuisine, please?
Yes, sure. I think, I would see it as, four main periods, as it were, in which Italian food, appeared, as it were, on the British table, or at least in the British eyes. Because the first items, in my view, from the Mediterranean were actually imported by the Romans after their colonization in 42 AD. Now, the point is that they stayed for nearly 400 years, and therefore they had plenty of time to import lots of plants, vegetables, herbs. They improved the cattle breeds and introduced new techniques for food preservation, for example, salting instead of smoking certain meats, especially pork. So that is certainly a distant, but in my view, palpable, contribution, because after all, if we find chestnuts and perhaps, walnuts in some parts, and Chris might confirm this, I hope, this was, again, one of the introduction made by the Romans for building purposes and for probably naval, construction and so on. So that is the earliest period. Then I think, the second important period in which Italian food arrived on the table of the aristocracy, at least, is the period of Henry VIII and even more Elizabeth I, because at that time there was an influx of Italian forced immigrants, if you like, because of the Reformation, and some of them, embraced Protestantism, and therefore it was dangerous to stay in Italy, and many of them, congregated in Britain. And therefore, Italian culture became also better known through books, translations, and also travel. And therefore, there is another reason why I think I put that period as important for Italian food, because around 1511, the Pope Julius II sent from Rome in one of his galleys, which was coming to London for other purposes, to collect some lead, apparently, which he needed for repairing, the roof of St. Peter's. He actually sent 100 wheels of Parmesan to the king, to Henry VIII. Now, I suspect that they made good use of it, on in banquets and so on the royal table, and probably among the aristocracy. So it seems to me that at the time, although there were two parties, so the ones who were wholly in favor of Italian culture and the others who spread, proverb, if you like, that an English Italianate is a devil incarnate. And there was the exact equivalent in Italian, un inglese italianato e un diavolo incarnato, exactly the same, and you find it in both texts, okay? So that is the period, where I think there was same. But even more, when the journeys, the trips, the travel started in seriousness at the end of the 17th century, and then in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it is calculated in one of the most important dictionaries of travelers that over 6,000 individuals reached Italy and spent time there. And therefore, they all, wrote diaries, they communicated about their experience, and especially some women were interested in the food as well. So they wrote home, about someone discovered polenta, for example, which was still unknown in Britain, or so some type of pasta and other food. So that was an important period. But the most important of all, I think, as you have hinted, was, in my view, the period of massive Italian immigration, dating from the Victorian period, let's say around 1840, to about the beginning of the new century. Thousands and thousands of Italians came to London and to other parts of the UK. And of course, many of them were keen to have a supply of ingredients that would allow them to produce, sort of familiar foods. And from that, I think they started the early cafes, the early shops, for Italian ingredients, and from there they developed, the little trattoria, the little the new restaurants and so on, which of course, were brought to fruition after the Second World War, with in a different and massive way, also because of the advent of mass media and and many other reasons, and marketing, as I'll mention later.
Fascinating. Wow. Thank you for breaking that up so clearly. It's extraordinary that actually our love affair with Italian food goes back to the Romans. But did the Romans, Diego, can I ask, did the Romans leave, did they appear and then when they left, did they take their food with them? Or do we know if there's any lasting influence from the Romans that survived? Is it possible to know that?
That is very difficult because, as you know, what historians used to call the Dark Ages haven't left many, many relics. What I suspect is that since after about 100 years of the Romans leaving, Christianity arrives in Canterbury and in Britain, and then some contacts between the archbishops or sort of the clergy, if you like, and Rome were maintained. And I discovered that sort of Sigeric, a great Archbishop of Canterbury, around 999, went to Rome, and the trip took about 3 months both ways. But on the way, he of course had the experience of many churches, of many little villages, and therefore of culture. And I would find it difficult, to believe that something sort of started in increasing. Also because of the connection between religious practice and food. When you think of it, to have the Eucharist, you need wheat. So you've got to cultivate it. Presumably you need some wine of some sort, whatever, even if it was probably a Serbic wine, you need the wine to celebrate Mass and so on and so forth. So obviously these things, I think, remain, but we haven't got evidence of, of Italian recipes, for example, until well into the late 13th, early 14th centuries.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Chris, if I can turn to you for a moment. Perhaps in the popular imagination, we think of gin as going back to, maybe when we think of the history of gin, we think of perhaps the Dutch drink, Genèvre, as a antecedent. But in fact, gin goes back much earlier than the Low Countries. In the 16th or 17th centuries. Can you give us a sense of how old gin is and tell us a little bit about its early history, please?
Yes, thank you, Samuel. Well, gin is a botanical drink with a very rich history, and that's why I'm interested in it, because I'm a botanist rather than an historian. So I'll explain a little bit about what gin is really before we then start to consider where it originated from. And of course, when we're talking about gin, we have to talk about juniper, because that is the defining botanical ingredient that makes gin what it is. It's the sine qua non of gin. In fact, without juniper, a drink today cannot be classified legally as a gin. So that is the sort of the signature flavour. And juniper is a gymnosperm, so it's related to conifers and pines. So the pedantic botanist in me, when we talk about juniper berries, these in fact are not berries botanically speaking. They're actually little cones, or they're more akin to pine cones, for example, than they are to berries. But nevertheless, let's consider those as juniper berries, because that's how we're familiar with them. And Diego and I were chatting before we started about juniper and how it's been used in Italian cuisine as well. And it's got that wonderful sort of pine-like fresh flavour that we're all familiar with. And there are different forms of juniper. So the one that we're talking about tends to grow on hillsides and mountains. And as Diogo was pointing out before we started, there are also these coastal thicket forms which are not so good. Nevertheless, so juniper is the defining ingredient. But your question, Samuel, was where does gin have its origins? And as I said, it's got a very rich and complicated history, and it's gone through a real evolution, which I guess we'll probably unpack through the course of this discussion. But if we think about gin in a broader sense, we can think about it as a botanical drink that contains juniper, but also many other botanicals besides. Particularly recently with the contemporary gins, there are all sorts of different plants that have found their way into gin, and again, maybe we'll chat about those in a little while. But besides juniper, there are others that people will be familiar with frequently: coriander and allspice and various herbs and aromatic plants, those that are very pungent and smell strong. And gin, as I say, in a broader sense, as a botanical beverage in which these botanicals, these plant parts have been macerated or ground up and then distilled in an alcoholic form. These date back, in fact, to the Mediterranean in ancient Greece, because it was actually, it has its origins in herbal medicine in the Mediterranean. So distillation technology, which is the process of purifying a liquid through heating and cooling, that was pioneered by the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, and it was used with all sorts of Mediterranean plants to flavour alcoholic drinks, including wines and tinctures, which were concentrated herbal extracts that were created by soaking these botanicals in alcohol and vinegar, which is not also different from the process by which these drinks are still made today. But I'd like to transport you briefly on this rather dreary, at least from where I'm sitting, January day, to the Mediterranean for a moment. And I'd like you to imagine yourself in the Mediterranean vegetation, which is a thick, dense and spiny thicket that covers that glorious red terra rossa landscape that we're familiar with in this part of the world. And it's, for a botanist, this is a really exciting place to be because it's a very botanically rich community of plants. And we tend to call this, we use the French word, which is maquis, or sometimes we use garrigue, which is the low-lying form of this green mantle that forms over the hillside. And it's strongly aromatic. These plants, they have to cope with long, hot summers. They have mild, damp winters, but these long, hot summers, and they're often aromatic, and they are packed full of these pungent oils, which we all know about, particularly in Italian cooking, things like thyme and rosemary. And these oils protect the plants under that searing Mediterranean sun, and they volatilize, they disperse into the air. And if you walk through this Mediterranean vegetation, you get this wonderful heady aroma of oregano, the smell of cistus, rosemary, thyme, fennel, and it all mixes into this powerful cocktail of Mediterranean herbs. And if we imagine for a moment that we then take that wonderful cocktail of Mediterranean herb smells, the essence of that, and then we distill that into an alcoholic form, this produced a sort of flavoured aromatic tincture, if you will. And there was a Greek physician called Hippocrates who used dittany of Crete, which is a particular type of, well, it's like an oregano. And like many of these plants, it grows out of the cliffs and the rocky gorges. And this could be used to make these tonics that were prescribed for all sorts of ills. And so really, this was the advent of macerating, crushing up these aromatic, oil-rich plants into an alcoholic distillate to make a tonic. And then from there, gin has that's where its origins were, and then it evolved into a drink much more like that with which we're familiar today, and we'll probably touch upon some of the later history further in the discussion, I would imagine. But that's where its origins lie. Wow,
wonderful. I didn't realize that it was as old as ancient Greece. That's fantastic. You've touched on ingredients a little bit, one or two ingredients, and I'd like to go on now from history to talk specifically about ingredients. And I'd like to ask you each a question. If we think a little bit more about ingredients, can I ask you each to think of two ingredients that somehow encapsulate or characterize gin and Italian food? Perhaps I could ask you each to think of one ordinary, one fairly common ingredient, and one slightly less ordinary or a bit exotic. Chris, can I start with you?
Yes, you can, and Samuel, I think I'll start where I left off, which is with juniper, because I must, because as I mentioned, if it doesn't have juniper, then it isn't the gin. But more than that, juniper is what gives it the dominant flavour that is what we understand to be a gin. It has that pine-like sort of fresh flavour that can then be built upon and contrasted or enhanced by all sorts of other botanicals, which I'll probably mention in a little while. And some of the more familiar ones are, for example, citrus, which give, again, a floral freshness and zinginess to the gin. And by the way, my mouth is watering, and I wish I had a gin and tonic next to me, but it's quite early in the day for that. But no, juniper is very, very important, and it and all the other botanicals, the distillers, they have very specific specifications. Sorry, that was tautology. They have specifications for these botanicals that they put into the gin, because it's a very complicated affair making a gin, as I've learned during the process of talking to distillers and during the research for this book. Because the botanicals that I've been talking about, they vary very much with the yield from year to year, with the climate, so different amounts of sun that concentrate the sugars in the fruits and the oils and the various parts of the plant, which bits are harvested and when. And so for juniper, for example, which is my first ingredient that I've chosen, there will be these very tight specifications for how the juniper must be and how it must be used. For example, the percentage of unripe berries that one is allowed to use versus ripe ones. And more than that, the provenance of the juniper, where it's grown. And so some distillers prefer to use juniper from hillsides in Macedonia and Central Europe, which are reputed to be some of the finer juniper berries. So the first part of the question was I think for a more conventional one, which I think has to be juniper. And the second one I'm going to choose is more astonishing because you wouldn't really associate it with gin in a conventional sense at all. And during the preparation for the Botany of gin, I looked at all sorts of different ingredients that have gone into gin. And one that I was astounded by was the baobab, or often pronounced these days Baobab, which is an extraordinary looking tree that is native to Africa and Madagascar. And it's what we call a pachycaule, which means it has this distended bottle-like trunk that's very, very much swollen and stores water for the plant because it grows in these semi-arid and desert-like regions. So it's an extraordinary looking thing, and you'll probably, I'm sure many of the listeners are familiar with this tree. It's often depicted in African landscapes, these giant sort of large distended trunks, and it has these very beautiful, creamy, white, pendulous, and they are pollinated by bats, which is why they're pale in color and sort of almost luminous in the evening light. And these are then followed by these ball-like fuzzy sort of fruits, which confer a sort of citrusy flavor again to gin. And so whilst distillers all over the world are producing these extraordinary new variants of gin, they're looking to their own floras that have gone well beyond where gin has its sort of its origins, and they're looking to their own floras and some of the plants characteristic of their parts of the world to put into gin. And so if you're making a South African gin, for example, you might consider putting a baobab in there. And for me, that encapsulates the change and the evolution of gin, particularly in the last decade or so. So those would be my two, Samuel.
Fascinating. Thank you very, very much. Diego, this is slightly an invidious question when it comes to Italian food, because one can think of so many ingredients, and indeed we are bombarded by we see in the supermarket ingredients that some of us have never come across before as being sort of regular things stocked in an item now. But if you had to choose two ingredients that somehow characterized or encapsulated Italian food in Britain today, one conventional and one less so, what would you choose?
It's very difficult, as you say. I agree, because you start thinking cured meats, sort of are an essential and apparently, part of the Italian food that is increasing, sort of abroad and so on, because some of it can only be produced in Italy, or at least in certain areas. Why is it that the most important prosciutto in Italy comes from Parma and the other one from near the Alps? And the reason is you need a combination of dry air from the sea and humid air from the plains for the actual maturing of good, Parma ham and so on. So that's one. Cheese, of course, so the variety of cheese is probably, sort of, I don't know, if comparable, at least, to that of French cheeses, which have acquired perhaps more international, renown. Pasta, of course, have so many different things. Olive oil, balsamic vinegar, you can go on and on. But the two that seem to me most significant, I would say, from a historical point of view and chronologically, as I've already mentioned, I would choose Parmesan, because it is something that starts very early. I mean, we have evidence of Parmesan coming from monks in Italy, the 13th century. It looks as if, they are the one who discovered the process of making it with skimmed milk. That is the secret. Not many people know, but you've got to have very good milk from excellent pastures. But then it is actually skimmed in the evening, if I remember rightly, and left overnight before, so that they start the process of heating it and so on and so forth. So I think Parmesan is very old, but as I mentioned, in Britain already, in the 16th century, and maybe earlier than that. So it seems to me that one essential ingredient, which was always found by travelers and so on in Italy, and some of them indeed objected to it, because they said, you can't have any dishes in Italy without some Parmesan on top. Not only the soups, but even meat and so on, sometimes it's got Parmesan. So many travelers objected to it, but it was there, and it is that the second one may be more mundane, because Parmesan is, after all, good Parmesan is expensive. Matured Parmesan is sometimes difficult to find and so on. But the second one, it means made a really great impact just after the Second World War. And I'm thinking of tinned tomatoes, because tinned tomatoes, after all, are versatile. They you can do lots of things with tinned tomatoes. And originally, they were just called peeled tomatoes, and that was the only variety that was on the shelves of supermarkets, probably in the late 60s, let's say 60s. But later on, it specialized. So you start having cherry tomatoes, tomatoes with the basil, tomato with other herbs, and so on and so on, chopped tomatoes, and then eventually passata, sort of the, which is produced beautifully by a firm from Parma, sort of, I should mention the name, since we are not in the BBC. My favorite one is Mutti, because it is very consistent, and they really, sort of pick tomatoes, I think, when they are absolutely ripe. I think that tin tomatoes are definitely better than any fresh tomatoes which are unripe or, tasteless. And therefore, they can be a substitute for excellent types of tomatoes. And they can go in an enormous amount of dishes. So those are my two choices today.
Interesting.
If you ask me tomorrow, it would be different.
It's hard to think of the fact that tin tomatoes were introduced into this country, that we haven't always had them, because I suspect they're a part of the staple cupboard, pantry cupboard of virtually every house in the country. Yeah. And it's interesting what you say about Parmesan. I wouldn't have thought of Parmesan as being something so old, so well established in Britain, and yet one's mind goes back to Samuel Pepys.
Of course, yeah.
There's a story about Samuel Pepys and Parmesan, isn't there?
Oh, yes. He mentions it in a page of his diary, September 1666. Of course, sort of the Great Fire is raging in London. And he and his friend, William Penn, are concerned about their produce. What are we going to do if the fire arrives here? The good wine from France will be destroyed. And he was concerned about my Parmesan, as he says. So they dig a hole in the garden, big hole, and they put in the good French wine and the Parmesan that belonged to Pepys. As a sort of, we don't know whether they went back to get it, because the fire did actually spare them. So, but I suspect that they made good use of it, both of them, of the wine and the Parmesan.
That's a wonderful story.
Because the reason why, Parmesan is so successful is probably due to what now, we call umami, which is sometimes known as the fifth sense, was discovered by a Japanese researcher at the beginning of the 20th century, I believe. So it has been around a long time. But things like anchovies and sardines and Parmesan are full of this intense kind of flavor.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, that leads me very neatly on to the third area I wanted to talk about, which is the subject of popularity. And since you've been talking about it, Diego, let's stay with you for a moment, please. Italian food has enjoyed such overwhelmingly enormous popularity in recent years. Like the cuisine of almost no other country, we have taken to Italian food in a big way. I'm sure the causes of this are many and actually quite complex. And this is a very difficult question to answer, but nevertheless, so far as we can express an opinion, what do you think this popularity, what is responsible for this popularity?
Yeah, it's due to many factors, as you say, and some of them very difficult to identify. But recently, I was struck by dates, sort of when certain things become very popular, and events in Italian popular culture, if we want to call it like that. And the first one is, I must say, the fact that Italy won the World Cup in 1982 and in 2006. and was a finalist in 1970 and 94. Now, if we look at the first two dates, 1982 and 1970, they are the periods in which there is an increase, considerable increase of Italian produce in British supermarkets. And it seems to me that this is coupled also with an increase in travel, of course, and from the 1980s in TV programs on Italian travel and food. Certainly, these helped. But also we can add another name, to the sort of cultural, if you like, sort of a contribution. And that is was born in my hometown, Giorgio Armani. He founded his house in 1975 again, and launched his first perfume for women in 1981. So as you can see, these dates struck me as something which, I'm not saying that they did it, but they contributed to the image of Italy, and therefore, sort of food was, as it were, attached to it. Of course, and Armani made other two perfumes in 1982 and the first for men in 1984. Now, his style has been defined as, I quote, elegant simplicity and sophistication. And if we look at it, this can be applied as it is to much, to a large portion, I think, of Italian food. It is simple, some of it, but it is also, it has got some sophistication and some elegance. So it seems to me that the spreading in Britain, coincides with this 1970, 1980 period in which many, sort of factors, took place.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Sorry, yeah.
And for that. Chris, can I move on to you for a moment? When we think about the renaissance of gin today, it's really quite extraordinary how gin has become, how gin has enjoyed such popularity. And I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of a botanist, can you survey this gin scene and tell us a little bit more about not just the drink that we see in the supermarket, but step behind that and look at the botany behind the botany and the ingredients, I suppose, behind this gin revival.
Sure, Samuel, and actually to understand gin is really like a botany lesson in and of itself, which is why I became fascinated with it. So I'll first talk a little bit about the different sorts of botanicals and how we might classify those that go into making gin. And then I'd like to give an example of a truly botanical, if there was one. So firstly, the different sorts of botanicals, by which I mean effectively different parts of plants that go into gin. And the first bucket, I guess we can broadly put those into, would be things that are berries or equivalent to being berries. So one we've already touched upon, of course, which is juniper, and we discussed that it isn't exactly a berry, but we can think of it as such. And similarly, citrus fruits, which are technically speaking something called hesper, but that's the specific type of fruits that characterizes citrus. So things like all the grapefruit, oranges, lemons, limes, a whole plethora of different citrus that go into gin. And they sort of enhance the pininess, if you like, of the juniper, bring a freshness and zinginess to the gin. We've then got a whole host of different seeds and spices that go into gin that give it often complexity and depth and a sort of warmth to the gin often. So I'm thinking of things off the top of my head, like cumin, for example, has been used, and coriander seeds and nutmeg and sort of warm, earthy spices that, as I say, give quite a different dimension to the gin. Then we've got the leaves and the sort of the vegetative parts, leaves and stems, of which there are all manner of different things that give it often a herbal sort of freshness. And then finally, we've got another group, which is, well, not finally, actually, penultimate group is, I would say, things like roots and bark, and those sort of, again, earthy notes that give structure and body to the gin. And a particularly common one that's often used is orris root, which I'm sure the listeners will be familiar with when talking about gin. But what people don't always know is that it is actually rather similar to the iris that we grow in our gardens, the bearded iris, and that what we call the root is in fact a rhizome, which is a sort of underground stem, which every good gardener will know that having grown irises, they love to bake in the sun. And this is ground up to make a fine powder that smells, at least to me, a lot like violets, actually. So that's another common constituent of gin. And then the final group, and I gave one example earlier, which is the baobab, are these unusual tropical fruits, which I decided in the book to group together for no particular reason, because they're not particularly related, other than that they're not conventional ingredients that go into making classical gins. And to me, some of them seem quite unexpected. Things like vanilla and longanberries and the baobab, as I mentioned, and I'm sure there are all sorts of others. And it seems to me that craft distillers can really justify anything into a gin these days. I think with varying degrees of success, to be honest, but I think it's fascinating that they're experimenting with all these different botanicals. The second part of my answer to your question, I said I'd give an example, and I will. And also a shameless plug for the Botanic Garden's own gin, which is called Physic Gin. And this is produced by the Oxford Artisan Distillery in collaboration with the Botanic Garden. And the master distiller there, who I mentioned before, Corey Mason, who's from California, and he's a real expert. And he visits the garden during the summer months and harvests various botanicals, and then spends an awful lot of time, effort, and dedication meticulously examining and balancing and weighing out the different types of botanical to strike on the perfect formulation with which to produce the Physic Gin that I mentioned. There are 25 different botanicals, most of which are actually harvested from the Botanic Garden itself, and all of which are inspired by the Catalogus, which is a list that was produced by the first keeper of the garden in the 1600s, Jacob Boabart the Elder. So he was a meticulous record keeper, and lucky for us that he was, because we now have a wonderful understanding of what was grown in the Botanic Garden 400 years ago, that is then corroborated by dried specimens of plants that are kept in the Oxford Herbaria. And so together, this meticulous record from Boabart and the collections that we have pressed in the herbaria tell us with certainty what was grown. And so it was inspired by this list that we chose those botanicals to go into the gin. And I should say at this point, as I'm sure our listeners will know, that the Botanic Garden was founded as a physic garden originally. So it was used to grow medicinal plants that would teach medical students about various properties and uses of plants, which was very important because firstly, herbal medicine featured more prominently then, and secondly, because if the plants were chosen incorrectly or prescribed in the wrong amounts, then of course that could have lethal consequences because many plants are toxic. And so founded as a physic garden to grow medicinal plants, I think it's wonderful that exactly 400 years later, because this is our 400th year, 2021, we were founded in 1621. 400 years later, we're producing a gin that is inspired by these plants that were grown in the garden. And as we've discovered, gin also has its roots, so to speak, in herbal medicine. And just a couple of examples then of the botanicals that go into Physic Gin. There's a range of citrus that go in there. There is rue, there's sweet woodruff, there is an artemisia, which is a wormwood, so people will be more familiar with that going into absinthe, for example. It has a sort of well, it's reputed to have an aniseedy smell, but it's not actually, to my mind. And then there's also I say a secret ingredient, but I've now divulged the secret so many times, I will again. It's Szechuan pepper, which grows at the Botanic Garden, and a little amount goes into the gin. And I love drinking the Physic Gin with others and seeing if people can discern that heat and spiciness. It's a very complex and botanical gin without compare, I would say.
Wonderful, wonderful. That leads me on very neatly to the last question about the idea of provenance and place. And you've been talking about the Botanic Garden, Chris. If we think of place a little bit more widely, and think about Britain, we tend to think of gin as a British drink. But as you've shown us, it's a drink with an ancient history. So my question to you is, in what sense is gin British? What contribution has Britain made to gin? Can you characterize that, please?
Yes, I can have a go. So
in the few minutes we have left to us, just to...
I'll keep it succinct. So I think, as we discovered at the beginning of the discussion, gin in a sensu lato perspective, in a very broad sense, we can date back to sort of antiquity, when people were macerating Mediterranean herbs and creating tinctures, and that's true of botanical beverages outside of gin. But even then, beyond ancient Greece, in the Middle Ages, monks and alchemists were still experimenting with various botanicals, including, I believe, juniper, to make sort of tinctures and tonics to cure all sorts of ills. So again, a sort of rudimentary form of gin, you could say, was evolving across southern Europe. Then there was a period of experimentation in the 1500s and 1600s, particularly in Holland. And I note your original question, Samuel, about Geneva. And the very word gin is actually connected to the Dutch word for gin, which today is a slightly different drink, but inspired by that was made by physicians at that time. Again, as a sort of medicine, so particularly for the Dutch colonies in the West Indies to cure various fevers. And so their gin in its evolution becomes a bit more refined and perhaps a bit more like the gin that we know today. And I think it's at this point that, to your question, Samuel, about where Britain comes in, because it's reputed that English soldiers who were serving in the Netherlands sort of picked up the idea of Dutch courage, shall we say, and somehow it made its way back to Great Britain. And there are various versions of how this happened, and perhaps it was an iterative process. Nevertheless, gin did make its way to Britain, and I have to say it has a rather checkered history initially. So gin emerged as an affordable and very potent drink, and importantly, it could be produced locally and quite easily, unlike, for example, wine. So it could be a drink that could be taken within about 10 days of processing. And it also had the perceived benefit initially of providing a market for a glut of surplus grain that had been produced by farmers. And so initially the Parliament backed with enthusiasm the production of gin, and they actually did away with the distilling monopolies, which meant that more or less anyone could take up making gin. And so this black market, if you like, of peddlers making and selling gin, that probably was a very questionable quality, but certainly had a very big impact. And this was the beginning of what was known as the Gin Craze, which has been described by some, not all, as I'll read, a lawless, drunken city of staggering men and women with increasing crime rates. And this And this was all, well, some of this was attributed to this new form of drunkenness. So it wasn't the civilized drink at all, Samuel, that we're familiar with today.
A rather infamous contribution we've made to gin.
Yes, but then it did evolve from there, and so if we think about the gin and tonic, for example, so there was the discovery that quinine could counter malaria. And so this gave gin a tonic, so to speak. So troops who were in India were told to drink quinine-based tonic water to protect them from malaria, and perhaps to make that very bitter-tasting quinine more palatable. As well as adding sugar and various other things, they may have added gin to that, and so the gin and tonic was born, which became sort of quintessentially known as an English drink. And so then we see that the birth of the gin and tonic, and then it goes a little bit quieter for a while, and there are various iterations, particularly around the evolution of the column still and how gin is made and refined. And there are various popular forms of London dry gin. But it's really much more recently that gin has taken off, and we have what I've heard described as a ginaissance. And it's really popular now and in vogue, and people love drinking gin and they're fascinated by it. And I think they like the idea of it being composed of different plants, which is why I find it interesting. And I actually think it's quite an exciting way to engage people, particularly young people, actually, with plants who might not otherwise be interested in plants and how plants are used. So I think, and recently, Britain has been quite prominent and front and center of these quirky craft and artisan gins, and you can see them up and down the country at various distilleries, and often actually associated with botanic gardens as well, I should say.
Excellent, thank you for that brief encapsulation. Diego, turning to you for a moment, I'd like to ask you a slightly different question. We talked earlier about the ubiquity of Italian food today and its enormous popularity. It's hard to imagine British culture without it today. Nigella, Jamie, it's so widespread. Do you ever worry that our version of Italian food or ingredients is somehow inauthentic and cheapened by its very popularity?
Well, when considering the success of food, we should not forget the role of marketing. And Anna Del Conte, the doyenne of Italian food writers, wonderful lady who, when she knew of my book, invited me for lunch, which was great. She's 90, invented the term Britalian. She did it probably in the late 40s, soon after arriving in Britain. She realized that there was a hybrid cuisine, as she called it, that originated in Italy, but was transformed to suit British taste. Now, there is evidence that supermarkets did carry out research specifically aimed at increasing sales, of course, and therefore different sources, different types of food. And Sainsbury in particular allowed me to see their archives, and they pointed out that the too authentic is sometimes disliked by the larger public, and therefore they couldn't afford, as it were, to have absolutely authentic sources. For example, many people disliked the excessive acidity of certain types of tomatoes, or certain sauces invented by southern Italian cooks with too much garlic, for example. That was also objected to. So they couldn't, actually have this, and turn down the authenticity, if you like. But it seems to me that this has happened all over the world, and it's inevitable that we also adapt things in our own kitchens. When we do things, maybe I haven't got all the ingredients, I make do with something else. And therefore there is always an adaptation. There's certainly, they found that there was a marked difference between a Soho delicatessen, for example, where they could afford to have genuine, let's say, Italian ingredients, and the supermarket. So, they had to adapt. And therefore, a certain level of adaptation seems to me inevitable. And the individual cook can always aim at originality or research of what is, in fact, authentic, because the meaning itself of the concept is not an easy one.
No, that's a very good point.
Because just think, in Italy, I mean, we always claim that there isn't an Italian cuisine. Regional ones, even city ones, differ from one to the other. So even that, sort of authenticity is a difficult concept. But many people would agree, in Italy at least, that there isn't such a thing as spaghetti bolognese.
No.
Because they've got to be tagliatelle. Okay? So yeah, because sort of the sauce would run off the spaghetti, and therefore sort of that's I mean, spag bol has become a British dish, and that is a very good example, of an adaptation of a Britalian dish, but not an authentic one.
Fascinating, wonderful. Thank you both very much for that quick bird's eye tour of gin and the popularity of Italian food, the botany of gin, I should say, sorry, and the popularity of Italian food, how we fell in love with Italian food. We have just 2-3 minutes left to us. I'm told that everything will go black at 2 o'clock. There are a number of questions, and I will have a go at reading these. If I could ask you both to respond as succinctly as possible. Janet Fern asks, which gins have Baobab in them? Chris.
Yes, I will have to get back to you on the name. It's a South African gin, and I'm sorry if I'm answering this succinctly. My most succinct answer, because I can't remember. In Baobab, you will find it with no difficulty, but apologies, I can't remember the exact name of the brand at the moment, but there are 2, I believe, I found.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you for your succinctness. Marianne Puxley asks, on visiting the trattorias of Pompeii, so much was familiar, but I was amazed to realize that they didn't have tomatoes. It is hard to imagine Italian type cuisine without them. When did they become available in Italy and here? Complex question.
But so it's very easily answered. The tomatoes originated in Southern America, what is today Mexico, and they were imported, by the first explorer. And we know that the first tomato in Europe arrived in Spain. But soon after, because of the context between Spain and Italy, they reached the botanic gardens of the Duke of Tuscany in 1543. Sort of there were tomatoes, but they were very strange things. People were extremely suspicious. They recognized them as a solanum plant, therefore potentially poisonous, and they didn't want to touch it. It was just beautiful to look at, So eventually, however, because of the contact between Spain and Naples, in Naples they became more adventurous. But it still took a very long time before the tomato entered into a sauce. In 1692, we do have the first tomato sauce from a cookery book published in Naples. And from there on, the tomatoes went into pizzas, into all sorts of, sauces, and they became very popular. But we are talking now of the 18th century. So that is when they start being used in normal kitchens. In Britain, I think, they probably arrived at the same time in the middle, I think, of the 19th century. And the first sauce, or dish with tomatoes, I think, is in cookery book of 1845.
Wonderful. There are so many more questions that are coming up now, but unfortunately, the clock tells me that we have 34 seconds left before our screens go black. So I'm very, very sorry we won't be able to take more questions.
No.
But if you want to know more, ladies and gentlemen, pick up these two books, both published by the Bodleian Library.
Wonderful.
And I'm very sorry we can't take all the questions, but we have run out of time this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us, all the friends of the Bodleian and all those who have come this afternoon. Special thanks to our speakers, Diego Zancani and Chris Thorogood. Thank you for telling us a little bit more, giving us a glimpse into your worlds of the botany of gin and our love for Italian food. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. And good afternoon to all.